open up the floor for some question and answers. Just a note, as you probably just got the pop-up, this meeting today is going to be recorded. So we should be pinned to the top, but just in case, if you don't want yourself on video, just you can turn off your screens. This will be presented out to people that missed it, that are going to come in and be able to watch it after the fact. So without further ado, I am Shelley Desautels, and I am the Liberal candidate for the North Okanagan Shuswap. I was born and raised in Vernon, and I've lived in Salmon for the last 7 years. Climate to me is important. I have a geography degree. I studied Earth Environmental Sciences. So to me, climate is huge. This is part of my education. I've grown up knowing that climate change is real. And I think this year in particular, we really, in our communities, saw that with the heat waves and the fires, that this is happening now, this is happening fast, and we need a plan. We need real action on getting to a place where we are adapted to it, and we are also slowing this down. And the Liberal Party has this fantastic plan, so I'm so glad that we can talk about this today. I'm going to turn this over to Sarah, who is kind of a co-host to this meeting today. Thank you, and Sarah, you can introduce yourself.
So hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I'm from Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola, and for anyone who doesn't know where that is, it's a little bit of Kelowna, all of West Kelowna, Peachland, Summerland, Coston, Karamias, Princeton, Logan Lake, Merritt, and everything in between. And it's a pretty large riding. And we actually happen to be on, or a large portion of us were on evacuation alert when this election got called. And so we're very aware of climate change, and at the doors, even in the smallest communities like Headley, everyone's asking, what are we doing? What are we doing? How are we addressing this? And they don't just mean by with more firefighters, which they're really happy about, but they're meaning, how do we get it so our fire seasons aren't getting worse and worse and worse? So I don't want to take too much time away from Mr. Wilkinson. So I'm going to throw it back to Shelley, and so we can get to questions and answers as quick as possible.
Perfect. So I'm going to introduce our lovely guest. Jonathan Wilkinson has served as Member of Parliament for North Vancouver since 2015. He was appointed Minister of Environment and Climate Change in 2019 and was previously the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. Prior to entering politics, he spent more than 20 successful years in the private sector, having held leadership positions with a number of companies dedicated to development of green technologies. As a Rhodes Scholar, Jonathan made use of his educational background in public policy when he worked as a constitutional negotiator and federal provincial relations specialist. He has served on several industry and charitable boards, and he formerly served as a board member and the treasurer of the Walter Duncan Gordon Foundation. Jonathan has deep roots in North Vancouver, where he spent the last 16 years raising his family alongside his wife, Tara, an avid runner, outdoorsman. Jonathan also serves as a coach for the North Shore Girls Soccer Association. So I'd love to turn the floor over to Jonathan. Thank you so much for coming here and joining us. We really look forward to the discussion today.
Sure, great. Thank you, Shelley and Sarah, for the invitation to come here today. I'm joining you from North Vancouver, which is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm happy to talk about any issue that you or your audience would like to talk about, but I think the focus is primarily around climate. Or at a minimum around the environment, which is broader than climate, obviously. So this government has certainly pursued an ambitious agenda with respect to environmental sustainability and environmental protection. That certainly relates to climate. I would tell you that it also relates very much to the second existential crisis that faces us, which is the rapid decline of biodiversity in this world that, if not slowed and ultimately halted and turned around, will have significant implications for humanity, as will climate change. But with respect to the climate issue particularly, because I think that's been a very hot topic and an important conversation that's been going on during this election campaign, And just as you, I hear a lot of concern about it at the doors. Maybe I can just say a few things. First and foremost, this is an existential threat. It's an existential threat that is not far away. I think Canadians, even those that are concerned about climate change, have felt like it was still 10 years away or 20 years away before we would actually start to really feel impacts from climate change. After the summer we had, I think most Canadians are aware that climate change is with us now. And that wasn't just the forest fires that we had here in BC and in other parts of Canada, but it was also extreme weather events that are happening in other parts of the world, like the flooding in Germany, the forest fires in Greece. So we are at a point where urgent action needs to be taken with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Canada and around the world. And concurrently, we need to be looking at how we adapt to some of the impacts of climate change that are with us today. We put together, over the course of the past couple of years, a strengthened climate plan. So we started a few years ago with what was called the Pan-Canadian Framework. We built upon that with more ambition and on regulatory issues, on pricing issues, on investments. And I and the Prime Minister announced that in December of last year. That was a plan that was very, very detailed. I would tell you it's probably the most detailed climate plan that exists anywhere in the world. And it was detailed for a very specific purpose, which was to provide a very clear pathway such that Canadians could see that it was possible for a government not only to establish a target, but to meet it. And this plan actually exceeded that target. We followed that up with significant investments in the budget, the 2021 budget. And that gave us visibility as to how we actually blew past that target. So we would get to about 36% reductions on a target of 30. But we all know that the Paris Agreement requires us to, on an ongoing basis, look to ratchet up the level of ambition and to ensure that the targets that we are establishing are consistent with what climate science is telling us we must do, which is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And so in that context, we stood with the United States, Japan, and the European Union and raised our target by up to 50%. And we have followed that on with a number of commitments in the platform, including a cap on oil and gas emissions in this country and 5-year binding targets on a pathway to net zero for that sector of the economy. That gives us confidence that we will actually achieve the target that we have established, the more aggressive target that we have established. The plan in aggregate actually looks at emission sources across the economy, every sector of the economy, and looks at how you transform those sectors in a manner that will not only reduce emissions, but will actually create economic opportunity for Canada going forward, so that you can actually talk to Canadians about the opportunities that will exist for their children as they grow up in terms of employment. And I would tell you that that plan was widely celebrated when it was announced, and that over the course of this election campaign, you've seen a number of expert commentators assess all of the parties' promises and the specificity of the commitments that they've actually made. And every reputable expert has said that the Liberal climate plan is head and shoulders above the others. That started with Mark Jacquard, who is a professor at Simon Fraser University and an expert in climate policy, has advised a range of different governments on climate policy, who indicated that the Liberal plan was something that would actually achieve an ambitious target, but that it was head and shoulders above all of the others. But it wasn't just Mark, it was also Catherine Hayhoe, who is an atmospheric scientist and a professor of political science, who is very well respected in the field. Same answer. It was Stuart Elgee, who was the director of the University of Ottawa group that actually works on environmental issues. Same answer. It was Generation Squeeze, which is actually run out of UBC and focuses on issues of critical importance to young people. Same answer. And it was Andrew Weaver, who is perhaps one of the most renowned climate scientists in Canada. He was the lead author on 4 International Panel on Climate Change reports. He used to be the lead editor of the Journal of Climate Science, which is the top climate science journal in the world. And he used to be the leader of the BC Green Party, so not a Liberal. And he has indicated that the federal Liberal plan is what he calls the gold standard. It is the most ambitious, but but achievable plan that he has ever seen. And so I would just say for folks that are actually concerned about the climate issue, we've worked very hard on this. And I will tell you personally, I have worked very hard on this. I got into politics because of climate after spending more than 15 years, as Shelley said, as a CEO in the clean tech sector. I am enormously proud of the work that has been done across this government, and certainly that is not just politicians, that is the civil service, but it's also with thoughtful provinces and territories. So enormous work done with Premier Horgan and his government here in British Columbia, but also with Premier Legault in Quebec. That has allowed us to move forward and will allow us to move forward in an accelerating way. With respect to adaptation, we obviously have to be thinking about how we adapt to some of the impacts of climate change. Extreme weather events, which are very difficult to predict, are certainly going to happen with increasing frequency. Science tells us that it is so. And so we have been working over the past number of years, investing significant funds. We set aside about $4 billion to do that, to work on projects that would help us to mitigate disasters and to mitigate the impacts of climate. We put more money into it in budget 2021. That has enabled us to, for example, look at building outside of Calgary a big reservoir to ensure that we don't have the same kind of flooding that they had back in 2013. We're also looking at similar projects in a number of other areas, which are really about flood protection, but we also have to be looking at forest management practices. How do we actually provide greater protection for communities in the interior of BC, in northern Saskatchewan, northern Ontario? On an ongoing basis, are there ways in which we can actually ensure that we're adapting? And we have set aside the funds, but we've also kicked off a process last year, which is developing effectively a national strategy on this, because provinces have a role to play in this, and municipalities have a role to play in this. It's not just the federal government. And we need to be hearing the voices, particularly of municipalities, in the context of helping to prioritize which needs are greatest. And so that work is ongoing, and we hope to actually have that strategy done next year, which will enable us to then follow on from a lot of the investments we're making with a list of the highest priority areas, the greatest areas of risk, where we actually need to be making investments going forward to ensure that we are thoughtfully adapting as much as we possibly can to some of the impacts that we are almost certainly going to see. So with that, I am more than happy to talk about anything to do with climate. I'm also happy to talk about anything else in the environmental area or elsewhere. So I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So everyone is welcome, if they have any questions, to enter it into the chat, and we will get to them as they come up. I do have a few questions, and I think Sarah has some questions too that have kind of come up with our discussions over the course of talking to the people. So on behalf of some of the folks that I have been talking to, can you help us understand the differences between the various platforms? So they all have targets. So how do these targets, speaking of emissions particularly, come into reality? And what should people be looking for when they are looking at a platform or a plan in order to consider the best one, since we all seem to have competing targets? How do we see which one is actually the best?
So I think that's a good question, and I do think that it's very difficult for many people to sort of differentiate and to be able to determine, which plans actually are achievable, which plans actually are things that are aligned with science. And I can sort of speak to sort of how I think about that, but I honestly think that perhaps the best way for people to inform themselves with respect to the positives and the negatives is to actually look at what some of the experts are saying. Like Mark Jacquard's paper, which was published in Policy Options, is quite a detailed assessment of each of the different plans, the positives and the negatives associated with each. I've kind of stepped through my perspective on the Liberal plan, which I would tell you is aligned with climate science. So achieving that target sets us up in a manner that achieving net zero by 2050, we believe, is very practical, but it's highly detailed. And so it actually does provide a pathway in each sector as to how we're going to do it. I would tell you that with respect to the Conservative Party of Canada, I would like to believe that we had reached the level of political maturity that they have in Europe, where Conservative parties in Europe actually not only believe in climate change, but actually have very strong views and plans as to how they're actually going to achieve it. I work with the UK government a lot because they are convening the Paris Agreement, the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow this fall. And that government is incredibly ambitious on climate. I'm sure that the Labour Party in Britain has a slightly different view about how to accomplish the targets that are being established, but they all agree that climate change is urgent and that you actually have to take bold action. We have not, unfortunately, reached that level of political maturity in this country. We still have a Conservative Party that is climate, at a minimum, climate reluctant. I mean, if you look at the party base, they were not even able to bring themselves to say that climate change is real. But, I mean, look, Aaron O'Toole opposed pricing and other measures in the climate plan every step of the way for the past 6 years. He opposed it entirely during his leadership campaign. And now that he's elected, he's trying to say something different in terms of what he would do. But he's also saying different things to different people. Like he's saying that he will meet the Paris targets. Well, he's actually not telling the truth, because Canada's obligations under the Paris Agreement are 40 to 45%. That's been filed with the United Nations as part of the increasing level of ambition that we're all required to do under the Paris Agreement. His target is 30. That is not a Paris target, and it's not a science-aligned target. He's not telling the truth when he says that. He says he's committed to putting in place carbon pricing now, but he's not prepared to put a backstop in place. So he's going to somehow have a nice conversation with Jason Kenney and Scott Moe and convince them, after fighting us all the way to the Supreme Court, that all of a sudden now carbon pricing is good. He is essentially putting forward, pieces of a climate plan, not a comprehensive one, but much of them are incoherent. Like his proposal with respect to pricing actually incents the consumption of hydrocarbons. The more hydrocarbons you burn and the more emissions you create, the more money you get back. It's a perverse incentive. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, in some senses and in some circumstances, it might be funny, that a policy position was so odd. But what I would say to you is climate change isn't funny. It's real and it's scary, and it's particularly scary for young people. And so I just say Canadians just cannot believe the Conservative Party on the climate issue. And anybody who is a climate concerned voter that is thinking about voting for the Conservative Party should think very seriously before they do that. On the NDP, there are lots of New Democrats who care deeply about climate change and are very ambitious with respect to the climate issue. There's no question about that. But the problem, I think, fundamentally with what the NDP has done in this campaign is a couple things. They essentially have copied a number of elements from the Liberal plan, which is fine, and I guess imitation is flattering at times. But other elements of their plan are so vague with no detail that it's not clear how you would actually do what they say they're going to do. And in particular, the industrial pricing part of their plan is I just don't think they understand it very well, because what would happen with their industrial pricing plan is it would actually cause industry to leave Canada and do nothing to reduce emissions. And I have suggested to Mr. Singh that he have a conversation with Premier Horgan and with Rachel Notley about how those systems work, because what they're proposing is not how Horgan nor Notley structured their pricing arrangements for very, very, very important and specific reasons. And this is why Mark Taccard in his assessment said that the NDP plan would be economically disastrous for Canada. In fact, he said that it would shrink the Canadian economy by 6.5%. So the plans are very much differentiated, but I would invite folks who are hearing noise between different parties to go and look at the Taccard paper, to go and look at Catherine Hayhoe's article in Chatelaine, to listen to what Andrew Weaver had to say in the post that he's done on Twitter. There's a lot of expert opinion that's weighing in on this, and it's pretty much unanimous that we have done the hard work, and we have the practical approach. And if you are a climate concerned voter, there's only one choice.
Thanks, Mr. Wilkinson. One of the questions that keeps coming up at my door, and actually the environment critic, Elvis, is the person I'm against in our debate about the environment, one of the things that he brought up was that we are, like, the Liberal government is nowhere near making targets. We've never made a target. We're going backwards on making our targets. And that we're just basically picking random numbers out. Now, obviously, I don't agree with that, but I'm trying to figure out how to sort of explain to him sort of where we were when we came in to power in sort of 2015, 2016, and where we are and why we're saying we're going to meet the targets in a sort of simplified language. And I'm finding that a little difficult at the door. Like, I know it and I can from a high level explain it, but for someone who's just like not an expert, how do you try to explain to someone, this is where we were and this is how we've sort of got there, and that's why we know we're on track? And because in my writing, they're hearing it's, you know, loud all the time, we're not there, you've never met a target, how can you say you're going to make a target?
So, I mean, Mr. Albus is following in the footsteps of his leader in the sense that he's saying things that just aren't true. When he says, you know, the Liberals have, the Trudeau Liberals have missed a target, that's just false. The only target that we had was a 2030 target, and 2030 isn't here yet. So the question then is, well, what has been done on the pathway to achieving the targets that we've set for 2030? And I would say a couple things there. First and foremost, the projections in 2015 when we took office were that if we continued on with what was in place at that point in time, emissions in Canada would have been 12% higher than 2005 levels by 2030. And of course, the Harper government had committed to 30% below, so a slight miss. And the fact that emissions were continuing to rise aggressively was a function of the fact that the Harper government did nothing on the climate issue. What we have done is put into place measures, many of them that take time to be fully implemented. Like, think about zero emission vehicles. I mean, you've got to get significant deployment after you've built the refueling infrastructure and you've started that deployment before you're going to see significant emissions reductions. But we have put into place a series of measures which have broken that trajectory. So emissions right now are 1% below 2005 levels by 2030. And we've put into place this plan, which actually steps you through how the reductions will be achieved in each of the different sectors of the economy on a pathway to reducing emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. That's enormously ambitious because we are already, you know, only 8.5 years away. And we have confidence based on the measures that are in there that we will achieve it. But don't just believe me. Go and read Mark Card's paper, because he does an assessment, as he has done for other parties, but also as he's done for other governments in the past. And his assessment actually shows that we will achieve that target based on everything that we put on the table, the investments, the regulatory measures, the pricing measures, that we will achieve the target. We are the only ones that can say that. And again, it does matter that the targets are science aligned, that they actually are on a pathway to the net zero, which, I mean, the Conservative Party cannot claim. They are going to be, as they've stated, they're going to roll back effectively Canada's climate target back to the previous target, which the Paris Agreement doesn't work like that. The Paris Agreement requires that countries actually become more ambitious through time, not less. And so effectively, Canada will be joining Syria and Nicaragua on the sidelines of the Paris Agreement under an Aaron O'Toole government.
So thank you very much for that. So we are going to jump to some of the questions that we've been receiving in the chat now. There's some great ones coming in. So the first one is from Jay Page, and he asks, are the emission limitations being set on the oil and gas sector scope 3 emissions, or just the production and transport emissions produced in Canada?
Yeah, they would be the production and the transport emissions that are produced in Canada. And that is essentially the nature of the way in which the Paris Agreement is structured, as you probably know, given the specificity of your question. Countries are responsible for their domestic emissions. They are responsible for reductions in their domestic emissions. Now, countries, particularly in the developed world, also have an obligation to be helping developing countries to mitigate and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. In fact, in that regard, Canada was recently asked by the international community to co-lead a process with Germany, which is ongoing right now, to raise fully the $100 billion a year that was committed by the developed world to help the developing world to do mitigation and adaptation. But the architecture of the Paris Agreement, the focus for countries in terms of their reductions are the ones they can directly control with policy levers under their control, which is the production and transport.
That actually kind of leads perfectly into the next question in the chat, which is, what is Canada doing internationally with other countries to assist poorer nations? Could you just elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, part of the deal under the Paris Agreement was that the developed world would help the developing world with this, because of course it was the developed world that created this problem. It wasn't countries in Africa emitting enormous amounts of CO2. It was the developed world that has created this problem, or the developed world and China more recently, and to a certain extent India. And so the deal was that the developed world would raise funds that would essentially go to projects in the developing world to help them to both mitigate their own domestic emissions, but also to help them to adapt to some of the impacts. And some of those are quite extreme, like small island states. I mean, there are threats in terms of their ongoing viability in terms of water level rise, or sea level rise. Canada has played an important role in that. We just announced a few months ago that we were doubling our international climate finance commitment as we approach Glasgow, as part of the effort to raise the $100 billion a year. And subsequent to that, we were asked by the international community, as I say, to co-lead the process of essentially corralling all of that money. And so that is something that I was working on with my German counterpart until the election. And we will see, what happens during the election. But I certainly hope to be able to go back and complete that work and report to the United Nations and the United Kingdom that we have been successful in doing that.
So our next question comes from Douglas Johnson. First, he wants to say thank you for taking the time to come join here in the North Okanagan Shuswap. So the oil and gas caps start in 2025. Under a Liberal majority scenario, you'll be fighting the next election on this sector cap. There's no baseline discussed today. Care to comment on that? And as well, subsidies so 41 million to Husky this week for White Rose. Why not stop subsidies today? And why no cap today?
So the cap is something that we are going to be working with the Net Zero Advisory Body on, as well as what the first target will be. And so that's something that we're going to start on immediately after the election, if in fact we're returned. We have to reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. There is no way around that if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. Oil and gas is the largest source of emissions in Canada. It's about 26%, with transportation being 25%, so pretty close. And so absolutely, this is something that we intend to begin on immediately after the election. In terms of fossil fuel subsidies, we are in violent agreement with folks that we actually need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And in fact, the commitment alongside our partners in the G20 was to eliminate them by 2025. And we put in our platform, eliminate them by 2023, so even earlier than that. But it is important in this context because you hear, these wild numbers that are thrown around, particularly by Mr. Singh, that we're clear on what we mean by fossil fuel subsidies and what we don't. And certainly anything that incents the exploration and the production of fossil fuels is a fossil fuel subsidy. But what we do not mean are a couple things. The first is Mr. Singh lumps in there, for example, the wage subsidy during COVID that applied to all industries in this country. He lumps in there the money that actually went to clean up orphan wells, which are an enormous environmental liability, and help to employ people at a time when there were many folks that were becoming unemployed. And of course, when we did the orphan wells agreements, we actually required of the provinces that they look at their regulatory regime to ensure that they were not allowing more of these things to become orphaned. Orphaned meaning there's no owner; the owner has essentially gone out of business. And so cleaning up those is an environmentally positive thing. Strangely enough, it was actually supported by many of the NDP MPs, and it was supported by Elizabeth May. But for some reason, the leader of the NDP thinks that's a fossil fuel subsidy. It's not. And then finally, some of the investments that are being made in different industries to reduce emissions. I mean, part of reducing emissions is doing it in a stepwise way, working through a transition. In my mind, those are not fossil fuel subsidies. Investments in clean technology on a pathway to net zero are not investments in fossil fuel subsidies. But yes, we are fully committed to eliminating by 2023 anything that incents the exploration and production of fossil fuels.
So, oh, sorry, Sarah.
That's okay. I was just going to read Julia B's.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So the next question is, you talk about more aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And last I heard, the Liberals announced a 40 to 45% reduction from 2005 levels. You have just mentioned 50%. Is that a new target? Climate researchers are now saying that fair share reduction needs to be closer to 60%. Is your target ambitious enough?
Well, we think our target is ambitious enough, and I don't think I said 50%. Our target is 40 to 45%. We just raised it by up to 50%. And of course, the way that the Paris Agreement is structured is that we will be looking to continue to increase ambition over time. I mean, when we started in 2015, we were not even going in the right direction in terms of achieving the 2030 target. We now have not only shown that we can achieve the 2030 target, but we've raised that target by up to 50%, and we've shown that we can achieve that target. And of course, we will be looking at ways in which we can further enhance the level of ambition as we move forward. Our view is that given the reductions and where they're coming from, that 40 to 45% is on the pathway to net zero, which is what scientists tell us we need to do. So that is the target for the present time. But of course, every country in the world is going to continue to need to look as to how it can further accelerate its ambition over time. I would also say that, you know, it's important in the context of just thinking about targets that they are aligned with net zero, but it's also important to think about them in domestic context. Some people look at Europe, and European countries, leading European countries, have slightly more ambitious targets, that's for sure. But the positive thing about Europe is they actually started on this pathway about 20 years ago. We went through 10 years of Stephen Harper where he did zero. And so to say, well, all of a sudden you should just imagine that the last 10 or 15 years didn't exist, it's just not reality, given the way in which you need to look at industries changing in the context of a relatively short period of time. So our target right now is 40 to 45%. We believe it's net zero aligned. I think most of the experts have said the same thing, but of course, we're going to look for ways to be more ambitious as we move forward.
So this morning I had a presentation at the local high school, and this is a question that came up out of there, and I told them that I would report back. So regarding the trucking industry and how we're addressing trucks as we're moving into this new electric vehicles, this greener fuel, the concern is that they won't have the power to haul large loads if they're required to go electric as well. So can you talk a little bit about that and how we're going to address things like the trucking industry?
And can I add on to that? Because what I've been hearing is that same question, but also from people that have to go out into, you know, the forest to get the logs. That's the other piece, is where do they recharge? I teach grade 6, 7. So this is something that they're like, well, how does that work? There's no electrical charging stations for my dad to hook up to in the middle of nowhere. So if we can add that piece as well, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about assuming that the same technology solutions apply across the piece in the transportation sector. I really, really doubt that that's going to be the case. In the light duty vehicle market, I think it's quite clear that electric vehicles have kind of won that race from a technology perspective, and they are coming down the cost curve. The issue is how far up that light duty into mid and then heavy duty can you go with electric vehicles, and the challenge as you get to bigger vehicles is you require very, bigger and bigger batteries, which make it very difficult because then you're taking up space that you would usually use for hauling things, and you run into some of the charging infrastructure issues, especially when you're using them in remote locations. So I think light duty vehicles are pretty clear, and in that I would include even some things like pickup trucks. I mean, Ford is coming out with an F-150 that's an electric vehicle within the next couple of years. But on heavy duty, the work that's being done, and I would say heavy duty is probably a couple of years behind, well, at least a couple of years behind light duty. But the work that is being done and the trials that are underway are really more focused on using hydrogen and fuel cells as the motive, the power engine or powertrain for larger trucks. It has the advantage that you don't actually get huge space requirements as you would for batteries. It also has better range with hydrogen. I actually drive a hydrogen fuel cell car, and it's a 600-kilometer range. So you get better range, which means that the refueling is a lot more like using diesel. So my bet is that's going to be the winning technology. And there are fleet trials going on right now in Alberta on that, and in the United States. So, and then in other types of transportation, you didn't ask this, but I mean, again, the solutions may be different. In the short term, my bet for aviation is it's going to be biofuels. There's a lot of work that's been done on biofuels. Eventually, you'll have to move beyond biofuels, but you can get significant GHG reductions if you actually develop the biofuels properly. And that's probably where you're going to see the planes go first.
So we have another question in the audience from Jay Page. Are trade tariffs being considered for products produced by countries that are not reducing their emissions? Example, products produced using coal-generated electricity. What about trade embargoes against those countries that are being uncooperative with reducing emissions?
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation going on about this in the international community. I would say Europe was probably the leader in terms of some of this. They're typically referred to as border carbon adjustments, where you put in place tariffs based on the carbon content of the goods that are being produced. Europe is talking about implementing this. They've been working on it now for a couple of years. We are certainly looking at that. The Americans are also looking at that. And it may well be that we end up with a system that is actually intended to protect domestic industry against imports that are high carbon, don't have to actually do the right thing in terms of reducing their carbon, but B, as a forcing function on countries that are not yet being ambitious enough on climate to ensure that they are. The caveat that I would put on it is these systems are not simple because different countries approach climate differently. So it would be relatively straightforward for Canada to do this with Europe, because Europe has an explicit price on carbon, just as we do. In the United States, they are set up quite differently from a legislative perspective, as we all know. And so they are likely going to go at climate through both regulatory mechanisms and enormous spending, rather than through an explicit price on carbon. And so to put a border carbon adjustment system on that protects the United States and Canada, you actually, in the United States context, have to figure out what the excuse me, the implicit carbon price is based on the spending that's been done and the regulatory pieces that have been put in place, in order that you can actually not only impute the price, but you can also then look at it relative to the carbon content of goods from offshore. So not simple by any stretch, but certainly this conversation is evolving in the international community. I would tell you this is one thing that I do think folks need to be concerned about with respect to the Conservative Party plan in Canada, which is if we roll back our price, or we roll back our target back to the Harper targets, our target would be significantly less ambitious than the Americans. And the risk is if they put in place a border carbon adjustment system at some point, that those would apply to Canada, because we're not doing our share in that context. And I'm not sure that Mr. O'Toole has quite figured that out yet.
Jack Drow has a question on here. It says, has the Liberal Party taken, and this is, I think, more about the environment than climate specifically, but has the Liberal Party taken a position on clear-cut logging in watersheds as a risk to safe drinking water and forests without ever increasing with the ever increasing and devastating forest fires? So I think it's just around clear-cut in watersheds.
Yeah. So I would say a couple things. The first is typically forestry and land management fall to the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces. And that's not something that the federal government is directly normally involved in. But we have said a few things with respect to the issues that you are raising. One is, I talked a little bit about the decline of biodiversity, and one of the big initiatives that we have been working on over the past number of years is increasing the level of protection for terrestrial and marine areas. And you got to start that with thinking about ecosystems that remain intact. Those are the easiest ones, because the other ones you're going to have to do a lot of work to restore them. before you can actually get back to an ecosystem that's kind of in balance. And so in that context, the old growth logging issue comes very much into fore. And we have said to the provincial government that we are willing to participate financially in working through that issue with them and with First Nations and with the local communities to try to find ways to protect more areas of old growth on a permanent basis. The second piece about watersheds, I totally agree with you. Like the issue of clear cutting along rivers in riparian areas is something that we are quite interested in having conversations about how we move away from that. That can be very bad for drinking water for sure, but it's also very bad for biodiversity. Like part of the salmon challenge, there are many issues contributing to the decline of wild Pacific salmon, but one of them is because we've essentially taken too much tree cover away from the riparian areas, you end up with soil erosion, and the productivity of the spawning of the salmon decreases very significantly as a function of the amount of sediment in the water. And so some of those issues are pretty important. And again, we have set aside in this last budget $2.3 billion for nature. And that's about actually trying to figure out how to protect some of these areas such that we are helping the biodiversity and essentially trying to exclude industrial activities in some of these sensitive areas.
So I have a question from Lawrence Owens. This may not be something that you have power over, but can we get Ms. Paul and Mr. Singh to agree with the Liberal climate policy and vote on Liberal climate policy?
You probably have to ask them. Look, I would like to see continued cooperation between the three parties on climate. I mean, my criticism of the NDP platform and of the Green platform isn't that they're not aspirational, isn't that they don't care about climate change. I think they all do. It's that I just don't think it's as well thought out in terms of how to get there as the Liberal plan. But I do think that in terms of trying to figure out how to increase ambition, we should be trying to find ways to reach across party lines. That's not always simple, but it does happen. I introduced into Parliament the Net Zero Accountability Act, which is about it's a forcing function to require all future governments to actually be serious about climate change and to bring forward serious plans. I will tell you, if the Conservative Party wins the election, I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge for them because unless they win a majority and they change the law requires them to bring forward within the next 4 months a detailed plan as to how they're going to meet the 40 to 45% target that Canada has signed up to in the international community. So I'm not entirely sure how they will manage that. But when I introduced that bill into Parliament, there were a lot of amendments that were made by the Parliamentary Committee. And many of them were actually made by the New Democratic Party. And we accepted those amendments. So there certainly are cases where we have done that. And I certainly would intend to try to continue with that going forward.
So the next question I see is from James Kiefer. It says, we're going to have to accept that fossil and biofuels are going to see continued use in forest operations. I don't think we should get stuck on that or villainize the industry for that reality. And I think that's more of a statement than a question, but I'll let you speak to it.
Sure. I totally agree with you. We can't villainize that industry or any other industry. We're all just trying to figure out what the solutions are that allow us to reduce emissions. And you yourself actually note that one of the pathways, at least in the short term, could be biofuels, as it probably will be for aviation. There are going to be some sectors of the Canadian economy where we're going to go through transitional fuels, and biofuels is definitely one of those. But there may also be some specific sectors of the economy where we just can't get all the way there into zero. That obviously can't be a large number of sectors, and it can't be a large volume of GHG emissions. But when I say net zero, it's net. It's net of subtractions, and there are two ways you can subtract carbon. One is through what are called nature-based solutions, which is about planting trees and restoring wetlands and grasslands that actually sequester carbon, or finding ways to enhance the sequestration capacity of soils. Soils used to contain more carbon than they do now. Or it's what are called negative emissions technologies, like what carbon engineering in Squamish is trying to do, where they're basically, it's like a giant vacuum cleaner that sucks CO2 out of the air. So, you know, net means net. It doesn't mean zero, it means net, but it's all got to balance out to zero.
So I have a question that came in earlier by email. There is, the EU is pursuing a global deal to slash planet warming methane. Is Canada a possible signatory to this agreement to cut methane emissions by at least 1/3 by 2030? And just your thoughts around that report.
Yeah, so methane emissions are really important. Methane is something like 26 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas emission. So reducing the amount of methane that's being emitted, and it's usually being emitted, there are not more than one source, but certainly the major source is often from oil and gas production, where it is effectively vented into the atmosphere. Yes, we have certainly been talking to the Europeans and to the Americans. We've been encouraging, to be honest, the Americans to be more ambitious on methane alongside us. Our targets are way more ambitious than what Europe is asking for there. So our target is 40 to 45% reduction by 2025 and 75% reduction by 2030. So Canada is a world leader in terms of methane. That actually, we think, is useful from an economic perspective as well, because it has enabled Canada to look at developing technologies that perhaps can help other countries to do some of these things. But I mean, when they say cut it by 1/3 by 2030, our target is 75.
I have to keep remembering to unmute myself. So we have another question from Lawrence. Could we touch a little bit on biodiversity issues facing Canada and what the Liberal policy is doing to improve these issues? Salmon was mentioned. Are there any other issues that we are looking at?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to address biodiversity in a comprehensive way. It's not a simple issue, because Canada actually has about 600 species that are either listed as being at risk of extinction or in the process of being listed by a scientific body that advises the government. So there are in the sort of medium to long term, the focus is really on these protected spaces. When our government came to power in 2015, the marine area of protection was 1%, and it's now over 14%. So huge improvement. We're now somewhere in the range of about 12.5, 13% in terms of terrestrial. And our focus is, and our promise is to get to 25% protection of marine and terrestrial areas by 2025 and 30% by 2030, which is what many countries who are ambitious on this in the international community have committed to. We're part of what's called the High Ambition Coalition, which is led by Costa Rica and France. And what that's about is essentially providing space for biodiversity to continue to exist. And as I say, with a real focus on intact ecosystems. But of course, we also have to look at how we live in better harmony with nature, even in areas that are not protected. And certainly on the marine side, you know, we've done a lot of work on Pacific salmon and on southern resident killer whales. But on the terrestrial side, there's a lot of work that's been done on a range of species, but probably the most iconic is caribou, where we're working on the protection of boreal caribou and trying to work with the mining industry and the forestry industry in a manner that actually will enable us to continue to have economic activity, but do so in a manner that actually is not destroying the caribou herds. And certainly Indigenous peoples are quite important in that conversation. You folks probably will be aware of the work that was done on southern mountain caribou with West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nations. So absolutely. And then the last piece I would say is we have a Species at Risk Act in this country. Normally it is mainly the province that is responsible for land management, and Crown lands are owned by the provinces. But the Species at Risk Act gives the federal government the ability to intervene when there are federally listed species that are not being appropriately protected. We have used that power in a number of areas, or we have threatened to use that power in a number of areas. And this is the first government that has really looked to fully implement the Species at Risk Act. I would tell you that provincial governments don't love us when we do that, but I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to be trying to figure out how to stem biodiversity loss, you have to use all your tools.
Can I just get maybe an expansion? When I'm talking to people about this specific thing around protecting land and the 25, all of the water and land, and I keep getting pushback in my writing of all that happens is you guys look at a map and go, oh, this place, this rock is good. Then it'll count towards our 20% or our 25%. And it's not really considering biodiversity. I, again, don't believe that to be true, but what's the process of how you guys pick sort of what's that land or what's that marine area that's going to become a protected area? Because I'm positive it is not just randomly you grab a map and go, oh, look, there's a nice space, we'll protect it. But that's the pushback I'm getting here from the candidates here. Actually, multiple parties are pushing it that way. Am I writing?
No, that's not how it works. I'm amazed somebody would say that.
Just so you know, I had 2 candidates telling people that in this writing that there's no criteria. It's just grab a map and pick something. So I want to make sure I'm not wrong on pushing back on that.
No. So there are a number of different ways it's assessed. There's certainly areas where we have a view around biodiversity, but the way that the initial program worked, the Canada Path to Target 1 program worked, was actually local communities themselves could put up their hands and say, we think that this area is important and we think it's deserving of protection. And then it went through a process of assessing that against a whole series of criteria to determine whether or not it actually was something that was of value from a biodiversity perspective, and how it ranked in terms of that, but also in terms of local support and a whole range of other things. I will tell you that many Indigenous communities put their hands up in that context around Indigenous conserved and protected areas. So the assessment is always one that focuses on biodiversity. That's the whole point in protection, is actually about enhancing biodiversity. So anybody who says that there's no thinking about biodiversity goes into that doesn't have any idea what they're talking about.
I thought I was right on that one, but I just thought you're here. I'm going to ask it because I get that a lot. So thanks.
So I have a question that came in beforehand. It's a little bit of a longer one, but I actually am really interested to hear what you have to say on it. As a GIS specialist, geographical informations, I work with maps and data, and data is a big part of our job. So this is from a hydrologist engineer. Environment Canada and Water Survey of Canada collect data across the country for use in hydrologic assessments. His professional association mandates him to consider potential impacts from climate change in all assessments and designs. And yet the data collection network has been underfunded and has been diminished during the past few decades, especially for smaller basins. At the same time, the technology to collect data and upload real-time results has improved and has in fact become cheaper. For example, it would be easy to throw gauges in small streams everywhere and have them automatically upload data. More data, including smaller basins, would give us engineers and researchers the tool and information we need to do our jobs better. So just wondering if Canada has this goal to increase the amount of data that can be collected and work as a Canada-wide. The provinces I know have their own individual ways, but these, I was doing my master's thesis using stream data collection stuff, and just wondering how we can utilize that technology and put it across Canada.
So I guess I would say a few things. Number one is the government's obviously not the only one that's doing data collection around some of these issues. And in some parts of the country, there are community-based organizations that are actually doing some of this stuff well ahead of the government. So I used to sit on the board of the Gordon Foundation. When I was there, we started a program called Data Stream, which was really about looking at water quality downstream of the oil sands and working with local communities around that. That is now expanded. They're doing work in a number of different provinces in this country. And part of it is all about open platform data sharing. So I would say, the government doesn't want to necessarily duplicate some of the stuff that's already being done, but absolutely there's more that we need to do with respect to water. It is the one area where I will say we've made enormous progress in most other areas on the environment, but we probably have more to do on water related issues, and it's one of the reasons that in our platform we've committed to a substantial allocation of funding for fresh water in this country going forward. And that includes many of the larger basins, but it can potentially include other, technological stuff. The last thing I will say, which will probably be no surprise to you, is the federal government has not always been a leader on digital, data gathering and utilizing modern digital tools to be able to actually do that and to be able to provide it in an accessible manner to people outside the government. That is also a work in progress. I will tell you that's not necessarily simple. A lot of the systems within the federal government are not the newest. And so that's why this government actually has a minister responsible for digital government to try to actually bring us forward by probably 20 years, such that we actually are not only gathering the data, but we actually are putting it into some kind of format that would be more accessible for people across the country.
I think there's one last question, and then I know you have to, well, I believe we have to go, but I'm hoping we can squeeze this one in for James. He wrote, we're going to at some point defend that financial resources are going to have to be heavily committed to help other countries meet their obligations, and that this will be viewed as coming at the cost of Canadians' quality of life. As Jay implied, some of these measures will be hostile. How are we going to sell that?
Well, I guess that must be referring to international climate finance.
Yeah, I think so.
And what I would say is, look, this is a global problem. It requires global solutions. And certainly the bulk of the responsibility that the government of Canada has is to ensure that Canada succeeds in reducing its carbon emissions in a manner that's consistent with what scientists are telling us must be done. But it's also fair to say that this is an international problem. It is a global problem, and developing countries simply do not have the financial capacity to address some of these issues on an ongoing basis, nor, to be entirely clear, are they particularly responsible for the carbon emissions that have essentially caused this problem. I mean, it's mainly industrialized countries that have emitted all of this. Now, the level of commitment on the part of governments, not just Canada, but the United States and Europe and others, to helping with this problem obviously has to fit within the context of what is affordable for the government of Canada. And certainly, we have to ensure that Canadians understand why it's important that we're doing this. And that's something that we will have to ensure that we continue to communicate. But we all have an incentive in ensuring that this gets done. If the whole architecture of Paris comes apart because the developed world is not prepared to do the things that it promised to do at Paris, well, I'm not sure anybody's interests are served. Certainly Canadians' interests are not served by runaway climate change.
So we do have, we can squeeze in a little bit more time. I think this next question, we're going to actually make this one the last question. I thank everyone here for participating and asking your questions and giving us your time. This last one I think is really critical. It's a message that we've been hearing a lot, that the messaging that we've been hearing on what we've been done, it kind of ties back into what we asked at the beginning. So this is from Jay Page. My impression is that there are still many people who do not understand climate change. Does the Liberal government have a plan to increase this type of education in Canada for the general public?
That's a good question. I think that's still a work in progress. I agree with you that there's more work that needs to be done with respect to public education. I don't think that's solely the responsibility of the government. I think it's the responsibility of the scientific community and educators and others as well. I think the biggest struggle for the federal government has been that we made a commitment to limit the amount of government advertising that was being done. And every time you launch a big public relations campaign, when you say that it's about education, you get the accusation that you're spending money for political purposes. And so we have tried to be thoughtful about how we do this without necessarily having to spend a lot of taxpayer money on it. But I do agree with you that there needs to be perhaps a more holistic strategy about how we actually get all of the different groups that care and are knowledgeable about the climate issue to perhaps work together on a strategy around education. That's all, honestly probably most particularly important for somewhat 35 and over demographic. I will tell you, young people these days, they understand the climate issue pretty well.
And I was going to say, as a teacher, I mean, it is part of the curriculum that we teach. And, you know, I teach 11 and 12-year-olds, and all of them, they're like, we know, Mrs. Eves, you don't need to tell us about this. Like,
Yeah.
So, and, you know, I've taught all the way up to grade 12, and it's the same thing. They're like, we know we have to recycle, and we know we have to, you know, walk or take the bus. So I think, like you say, the younger kids, they get it, and they actually are probably see it as more urgent even than us adults see it. And they want it dealt with now. But I find when I'm at the doors, the people that give me the most pushback are the people my age, right? That 45-ish, not that I want to admit that, but yeah, 45. That seems to be the sort of biggest pushback I get from not the younger guys.
So we're going to wrap up our meeting today. Thank you so much, Minister Wilkinson, for joining us, being able to give your time to talk with us and answer these questions. Thank you, everyone who attended and who asked their questions. We don't find out answers unless we ask them. So this is the most brilliant way to be able to get it from the person who knows it the best. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And again, if anyone has any questions that they didn't quite get a chance to ask or that you think of afterwards, feel free to email my team. It is Shelley D4FORMP@gmail.com, and you can send that and we can get any responses back from Minister Wilkinson on any topics that you want to cover. He's been a fabulous resource to us. And again, thank you.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.